Yeah.
What's the name of it?
Well, this is Rebbetzin Tziporah Heller, whose book we're discussing.
And she went to that place, Neve. Remember when Nama suggested I go to this place?
Yeah, in Yerushalayim.
I would like to go.
I went there for a day.
You did? Too?
I would love it.
I'd like to go there too.
She's very interesting
Maybe we'll
speaker.
go.
I think I was
Like Rodney Dangerfield in that movie.
Yeah, let's
Well, different, but okay.
I can just see it. That's funny. Anyway, so last week we started discussing her chapter 1, in which she really gives a very nice sort of intelligent rationale for why a secular Western feminism arose in the late 20th century. In other words, and she puts it, it's very logical that feminism would have arisen because there was a huge gap in terms of meaningful activities for both men and women, but especially for women in the mid 20th century. Women had a lot more time on their hands. They had fewer household chores they needed to do by hand. They had washer dryers and refrigerators and dishwashers and things like that made their lives more, less consumed with just the drudgery of housework. But as a result, it left a gap of meaning. What do I do with myself now? And women filled it with, things like mahjong and lunching with your friends. But that was not. Right. Organizations for women that they had to fill their time with something, and some of it was very meaningful, but a lot of it was not meaningful. And at the same time, you had a spiritual sort of lack in the society in general, where women used to be recognized as the spiritual foundations of their families. Now the school teacher sort of took over the role of instructor. And not only that, but moral values in general were not seen as marketable and as valuable as, say, math and science and history, which would allow you to move up in the social ladder, get a good job, and et cetera, et cetera. You're wanted.
So got that all taken care of for you, Barb. It's flowing good and got strained.
So,
do you want me to go pick
so
up the seat
into
for you?
this
Okay, I'll be back shortly.
vacuum of values and meaning came the feminists who said, "What are we doing with our lives? Why are you just sitting at home and baking the like as we mentioned last week, the best bunt? That was all your life is about. It's pretty meaningless." And it's true, it was. On the Jewish front, as we mentioned last week, on the Jewish front, you didn't have the same kind of dilemma, because the Jewish woman always recognized that what her value was, that her value transcended the drudgery of the housework. It's never about housework for us, right? And we always go back to the famous poem by Shlomo HaMelech and Woman of Valor. There's no description of her doing her kitchen floors are not shiny. That's not what she's being praised for. She's being praised for the values that she's instilling in her household, and the way that she attends to each person with their own needs, and her business acumen, and her what her family is known for, what her husband is known for in the public sphere, which is a reflection of what she does in the private sphere. So we never had that sort of dilemma of what is the meaning of my life, and what do I have to fill my days with? Yes. Well, yes. More generally speaking, Jewish, but yes.
Women with spirituality. You would see that value outweighed all the other duties she had to do.
It wasn't that so much as the duties that she had to do were seen in its proper context. In other words, not as an end goal in themselves, right? But as a way of, and again, it was never a necessary part of her job description. In the marriage contract, she's not required to sweep the floors and do the dishes. As a matter of fact, the husband is required to hire cleaning help to help his wife if he can afford it. So it was never the housework is necessary to get done, But like I said, number one, she doesn't have to be the one doing it. And number two, it was always seen as a means to the end. The end goal was not the clean kitchen. The goal was having a house and a home that in which you can develop, the right atmosphere and the right outlook on life and the right attitude towards Torah and the children who appreciate Torah and it's all, having a nice clean house and wonderful challah is nice. Is a way of getting to that goal. It's not a goal in itself. So that I think was, and yeah, you're right. I'm talking about religious Jews rather than the secular. The more secular a woman gets, the less she would value that, and that has somewhat to do with the fact that the public became more valuable than the private, which is a reflection of what happened in the secular feminism, right? Because again, if you're separating out the spiritual from the home, then the home is really just an empty shell, right? And so, yes, it makes a lot of sense that the feminists would go, wait a minute, we don't have anything of value. Well, it must be the men who have something of value. And the men did have something of value. As I said, the men's role throughout society didn't really change all that much, right? In terms of the outward things that they were doing. They had to, make a living. They had to go and either in the agrarian societies farm the land, and in the industrial societies they worked in the factories. And then as time went on, they moved up socially, and maybe they had their own business, but they still had to accomplish the goal of making money and supporting the family, right? I'm talking about in the secular world now. And so their role didn't change, their goals didn't change. Their values didn't change. They always knew what they were about. And because, again, the woman's role was in the home, once the meaning was taken out of that home, so then what are the women left with? Oh, what he's doing looks really interesting. So that became the standard of value. That became the goal that women wanted to aspire to. Equality meant I have to do the same thing that he does because his life is full of meaning and mine isn't full of meaning. So therefore, let me do what he's doing as a way to get meaning in my life, right? So she's really explaining it from that point of view. It's very logical, as a logical outcropping of what was going on in society. So now we come to chapter 2, and chapter 2 is called Acknowledging Differences. Okay, and we have discussed this before, but I'll just give you a brief brief overview of what she's discussing here. She does talk about the differences between men and women, and part of the interesting part of this chapter is how she delineates from a Torah perspective those differences: physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. So we'll get to that in a minute, but of course she begins by saying what we know is that God created men and women differently, right? And feminism holds that there are no differences in men and women, and what there are just by virtue of socialization, right? It's all socialization because women are trained to be a certain way and men are trained to be a certain way. We believe that they differ, but that also, not only do they differ, but that the differences are beneficial to each gender, to sexes, right? So in the West, we generally describe differences in terms of relative worth. Two things are different, one is better than the other. But there is a concept that two things are different and neither one is better than the other. We say a goldfish is different from a blowfish, for example, but we don't think that one is inherently better than the other. So now, we also know that God makes a very big deal about how woman is created. No other creature that he creates that we're told about in the Torah, no other creature has such a detailed description of how she was created or separated from man, because we know, right, that the original Adam and Eve creature was one androgynous being, right? It was one body that had both features of both sexes. It was a back-to-back creature. It was a very inconvenient in one way, but very convenient in another way, because he was completely self-sufficient, and it says he could even reproduce itself.
How did he do that?
I don't know. But he had everything he needed. But God said in the text, it's not good for man to be alone. So if he had everything he needed, what wasn't good about him being, what was not good about this situation? Okay, so do you remember, anyone remember, we've talked about this before, what isn't good about being self-sufficient?
He needs a helpmate.
Why, if
No.
he's self-sufficient?
No.
He doesn't need help. At this point,
Right.
yeah, okay, that's,
Was it the spiritual part of it or something?
mm-hmm,
It had a spiritual side to it, right?
yep, yeah. When you're independent, what's not good about being independent?
Oh, you don't need, like,
You
you
don't
wanted
need- yeah.
him to need something.
Yes,
So-
yes. So what? So why?
To learn to be grateful.
Yes, and yes, yeah,
To have a void.
yeah.
Oh
Yeah.
my God.
Yeah, you're getting it.
I
You're on the right
totally
track. You're on the right
remember,
track. When you're independent, there is an illusion of complete power and control over your life, right? But the truth of the matter is, God did not want man to feel completely independent. Okay. Now, by the way, there's no Hebrew word for independent, which is interesting. Okay. We idealize independence because dependence implies weakness, right? Vulnerability. We don't want to be weak and vulnerable. But when you are independent, you have no sense of gratitude, right? There's no reason to be grateful. If I'm a self-sufficient person and I don't have anybody in my life that I need, right? So I'm not thankful for anybody in my life because I don't need anybody. I don't have, right? And so God wanted us to have a lack so that we would view ourselves as dependent. If Adam had remained completely independent, he would have viewed himself as godly. God did not want Adam to view himself as godly. God wanted Adam to view himself as needing God. So an egocentric view of the world would have arisen if he stayed in the same form. So in order for a God-centered view of the world to develop, he had to be lacking something so that he would be able to recognize that he needs help and it's coming from some other source. Okay. The other reason is that God wanted us to be able to imitate him. That's really the purpose of our being here on earth, is to imitate Hashem, right? So what does it mean to imitate Hashem? Well, it means to be like him. Well, what is God like? Well, if you ask a 3-year-old child, you ask an adult intellectual, you'll get, you say, what is God? The definition is usually going to be something like, well, he gives us life, or he gives us the world. He made the world. He gives us food. He gives us clothes, right? I mean, what else is he? He gives us things. And that's how we identify him. We identify him as a giver. Now, if we're going to copy God, so that's the attribute that he wants us to copy. God has many attributes, but that's the biggie that we can imitate, certainly, right? We can imitate, and we're supposed to imitate him in a lot of different ways, but giving is the major one that he wants us to imitate him. So, giving, how do we give? What is giving? Okay, now we go back to this idea of being independent versus dependent. Now, there's different kinds of giving, right? There's false giving, illusory giving, and there's true giving. What is false, illusory giving? I knit you an ugly sweater that you're never going to wear, so I've given it to you, but I really haven't given you anything you want. I give, I write the check for my son to go to MIT, but he wants to go to Notre Dame. So I've given him something, but nothing that he needs. So that's illusory giving. Versus, I'm giving you something that you want and need, either for your development or your growth or whatever. So that's true giving, right? So therefore, when God divided this being, he did it in such a way so that all the aspects of the self were different. Emotional, physical, right, intellectual elements of each creature were now lacking in something that the other can provide. Because if they're both the same creature, there's no need to give. There's no need to give if we're exactly the same. I have nothing to offer you, and you have no lack that I can fulfill. And that's why he created them differently. So the worst response to there being two sexes is to pretend it's a mistake. It's not a mistake. God is trying to obliterate the idea that it's good to be autonomous. Okay. Now, of course, we understand that people differ from one another. Every person on this planet differs from one another, and generally speaking, though, the largest differences you're going to find between human beings are between the sexes, right? Okay. So again, in Judaism, we have also developed the idea that the differences, because of these differences, the Torah and halacha and mitzvos are geared towards each gender, towards each sex, based on their differences. And this is something she gets into in a future chapter, which is really interesting. But in other words, just like a parent with two children, one of them is talented in piano and the other is talented in art. So they're going to encourage those talents, right? They're going to foster those individual talents. They're not going to make the piano player take art. Well, maybe some parents will, but that's really because of their own desires rather than what's best necessarily for the child. I mean, it's possible. Obviously, it's good for everybody to know piano. It's good for everybody to learn how to paint. Right. But if you see a particular talent in your child, you're going to foster that talent rather than say, well, you have these talents, or maybe you don't have these talents. Maybe it's just me that I socialized you into these talents. And so therefore, let's have you do something else because I'm really interested. I think it's better that you're both equal. Okay, getting back to that idea of equality here. So you and your brother, you and your brother are going to do the same exact things because I don't want you to be different. And, you're going to foster the individual aptitudes that each child has. And that's the position the Torah takes, that God created us differently and therefore, and really also in order to develop ourselves according to the lines of difference that he delineated for us. Right? Okay. So we talked about the way in which woman was separated, which tells us about her qualities. Most obviously is the verb that the Torah uses for how Hashem separated Chava from Adam. It says he built her, vayiven, right? Vayiven has the same shoresh as the word bina, which means insight. And so the rabbis say, well, women were given more of the quality of insight. We're going to get into this actually when we discuss the differences. The important thing to know here is that she's taken from the rib, the internal side, either the rib or the side. We're not sure exactly what it's referring to, but most people explain it as a rib. And so the rabbis say that's because she is, what is the function of the rib? The function of the rib is to protect the vital organs, right? And so she is the protector of the internal qualities that are so important in the spiritual life. What this means is that she is going to be self-actualized from the inside, while he is self-actualized from the outside. Okay, and she'll explain this a little bit more as we go. We also know that God calls her Ezer Kenegdo, helper against him, right? And Rashi says, what does it mean? Well, if he is worthy, she will be a helper. If he is not worthy, she's going to be against him, meaning her job is to keep him on the straight and narrow, right? But it's also important to understand the word Ezer, helper, does not mean someone who is below, right? It means someone whose help is so important and so necessary and vital that it equalizes their relationship. As we mentioned, just like, for example, a doctor, when you go to a doctor for help, right? That doctor you're paying him, right? But it's not like paying a cleaning lady to wash your floors. You're paying him to save your life sometimes, right? And so his help is of a certain level of importance that puts him, at least on an equal footing with you. It's not the same kind of help. This is the same kind of help that she is. It's not that's someone under him, right? Okay, so now she talks about the differences between men and women. So physical differences are obvious, and the most obvious physical differences are reproductive differences. Men's reproductive system is external, and women's is internal. And their sexuality follows from this. She says a man's most direct experience of his masculinity comes from the external act of sexual relations, while a woman's, experience of her femininity comes from internal experiences: menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, lactation. Those are all internal events, really. Now, she says in Judaism, physical realities. Okay, so why is it important? How do the physical differences relate to anything spiritual? She says physical realities are reflective of deeper spiritual realities. She says God created our bodies to express our souls. The pasuk says in Genesis, okay, let us make the human in our image, after our likeness. Okay, so there's two sort of, it sounds like repetitive phrases here. Hashem says to the angels, let us make human in our image, after our likeness. So that sounds like it's the same phrase repeated, and the question is asked, why? We know that there's never any excess words or sentences used. So the question arises, what does it mean? Why are we using two phrases? Rashi answers this by saying that after our likeness refers to spiritual and intellectual qualities of comprehension and discernment that make us similar to God. In other words, we have certain intellectual properties, for example, the animals do not, right? There was this certain self-awareness that makes us more godly than animalistic. Our speech is also another thing that makes us more godly than animalistic. And the phrase in our image, she says, refers to physicality, a physical portrait of our Creator. So there's still a little problem here, right? God doesn't have any physicality. So how can it be that we look like God? There's no physicality to God. What it means is that we reflect something of God in our external selves. In other words, our bodies still have some imprint of godliness. How? Because the body is the soul's means of expression, right? In other words, the soul is in the body, and the soul uses the body to express itself. The soul, the only. I meant S-O-L-E. The only way that the soul can express its desires, by the way, what would be the soul's desire? What is the soul's only desire? The soul, remember, what is the neshama of the soul?
You take your path, your specific, unique path in life.
The soul is the spark of Hashem in us.
Yeah, it basically comes from God. It's that divine, it's a piece of the divine being. And its sole purpose in this life is to do God's will, okay? The body, of course, conflicts with that, right, that purpose, because the body has its own desires, totally different from the soul, which is why we are sinners, all of us, and it to do a mitzvah sometimes takes all of our will and effort, and we're not always representing the best of our souls because of the body. However, the body is the best the soul has got in terms of allowing that expression of God's purpose to be expressed. In other words, the soul wants me to eat, only kosher foods. Well, that involves me taking with my hands the right food, and, shechting it the right way, or paying someone to shecht the right way, and making a bracha over it, and then eating it properly, in all the contexts that we understand what kosher food means and what eating according to the Torah means, right? So there's that sort of grudging acknowledgement from the soul that, this is not only grudging acknowledgement, more than that. This is the way that the soul can express itself, through the body. And so therefore, the limbs parallel an aspect of the soul and has a physical and correlating spiritual function. The rabbis say that the commandments are the means for the soul body to express itself. They're like limbs and organs of the physical body. So there's this correlation between mitzvos and our limbs, okay? And accordingly, the various distinctions between men and women in the Torah are intended for each one separately and each have spiritual significance. So those physical differences, okay, right? The physical differences between men and women right? They reflect the spiritual differences in both, and accordingly, the mitzvos are going to be geared towards those differences, right? Okay, so that's, you understood, did I say it too quickly? Everyone on the same page? Okay, now we come to intellectual differences. Okay, so this gets a little deeper here. She brings in Kabbalah. So in Kabbalah, in the Zohar, it talks about 10 sfirot of God, which means basically 10 sort of different emanations of the divine being, or 10 different attributes of God, right? 7 of them are intellectual, and 7 are emotional or emotive, and 3 are cognitive or intellectual. The 3 cognitive emanations are referred to as Chachma, Bina, and Das. Chachma translates to knowledge or wisdom, Bina as insight, and Das as analysis of thought. It's really a very, what's the word? I'm blanking out here. Huh?
General?
It's general, very shallow or shallow, but
Cursory overview.
yes, overview of what those are. There's it's like I said, it's deep. We're discussing deep level stuff here, but generally speaking, that's how it can be. They can be defined. By the way, those 3 ways of thinking or ways of those intellectual qualities form the acronym of Chabad. Chachma, Bina, Das. That's where the word Chabad comes from. Why they chose to use Chachma, Bina, Das, I'm not sure, but you have to ask them. But anyway, okay. So, Chachma, as I said, Chachma is wisdom, Bina, Das. Bina is insight. Insight meaning you are understanding one thing from inside another. You're going on a deep level and you're making connections between things. And Da'as is analyzing external relationships of one thing to another. All right. Men were given more of, now everybody has all 3, right? But men were given an extra helping of Da'as, so external reasoning and analysis, and women were given an extra helping of Bina, insight. And again, the rabbis say that this is so because of the way that the language the Torah uses about how she was built. The word vayiven, he built, Hashem built, has the same shoresh as Bina. Okay, so therefore they surmise that she was given an extra helping of insight. Question? Oh, okay. Now, this is shown and paralleled, actually, the proof of this is in the way the Torah was given to the Jews. Okay, so number 1, there's two things here. We know that Hashem told Moshe regarding the giving of the Torah, when it came time to give the Torah, Hashem says like this, say this to the house of Jacob and tell it to the children of Israel. So again, you have a double language there. I mean, a double phrasing of the same idea. Why the say it to the house of Jacob, meaning tell the Torah, right? Give it over to the house of Jacob, and tell it to the that's all right, and tell it to the children of Israel. So the question is, why the double language? So Rashi says the house of Jacob refers to the women. First, tell it to the women. By the way, House of Jacob, Beis Yaakov, which is why the girls' educational movement is called Beis Yaakov movement, from this pasuk. Tell it to the women first, tell it to the House of Jacob, and then afterwards you can tell to the men. So part of that, because the meaning as Rashi explained it is that as or if the women accept it, so too will the men. In other words, the women have to accept it for it to be able to be passed on. If the women don't accept it, it will not be accepted. Okay. But Heller mentions an interesting point. The Torah really wasn't given over twice. So what does it mean? In her view, there's another meaning here. because the Torah wasn't given over twice. So the meaning to her is that women and men heard at the same time, but the women integrated it first. They completely integrated it into they received and integrated it into their whole systems before the men were able to integrate that information. And that, she says, was as a result of Bina. She gives an example of this from her own experience. Excuse me. She says in her life, she's seen a lot of Balei Tshuva, people who have come back to the faith, as it were. And she says she sees a marked difference in the way that the religion is integrated between men and women. She says men focus on the structures of the law and the mitzvos, and I think we can all. I mean, I see it in the men in my life, where they're focused on minyan, and you got to get to minyan, and you got to make a minyan, and you got to do this, and you have to do that, and the tefillin, and you have to do it this way, and not this way, and not that. Right? There's the details and the structures of the mitzvos are very important to the men, and they focus on that. And she says, whereas the women seem to have a more holistic integration of the entire religion that happens before the men. So she sees it, like I said, she's using her own life experience to say they have a complete personal integration with Torah that the men just don't get to. And she also attributes that to Bina. Okay. So that's the first example from the Torah regarding the giving of the Torah that sort of proves this difference in women and men's intellectual capabilities. Okay, the second thing comes from a quote from Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, in Mishlei. He says, Shema b'ni, listen, my son, Musar avicha, to the teachings of your father. Okay, Musar really is really understood more as like criticism, like a harsher sort of teaching. The al titosh Torah simecha, and don't forget the Torah of your mother. Okay, so again, we have two different ways of hearing Torah or understanding Torah. Something's going on. There was only one Torah given. Again, that's the same point, right? In addition, you might raise the objection that Shlomo HaMelech certainly knew that women don't have the same level of obligation when it comes to teaching or giving over or learning Torah. So why is he even mentioning that women have, your mother is going to teach you Torah? Women don't have the obligation to teach Torah. The father has the obligation to teach his son Torah. Okay, so there are two types of learning here, obviously, or teaching that Shlomo is touching on. Now, these two types of learning are reflected again in the way that the Torah, specifically the Ten Commandments, were given to the Jews. So they were given twice, right? I don't know if you remember this, but they were given twice. First time Moshe came down from the mountain with the two tablets, and he sees, and in that giving of the luchos, in the giving over of the Aseres HaDibros, it was accompanied by thunder and lightning and shofar, and the mountains shook, and the world heard it. It was just fire and brimstone kind of presentation. Here's the law, and you better keep it, right? It was that kind of presentation, right? That's the Musar aspect of Torah. That's the, right? But then there was a second way of giving it, which was much less surround sound experience, right? It was the mother's Torah. That Torah is more about not keep this mitzvah, but here's why this is important. It was a more understanding of the values that underlay the mitzvos, right? So that's the mother's Torah. The mother's Torah is teaching the values, and this is shown in the difference in the way that mothers and fathers discipline and teach, right? We know there's definitely a difference in that. So Shlomo is describing two ways of understanding the Torah, two ways of giving over the Torah. And so he's not wrong when he says, listen to the Musar of your father, but also don't forget what your mother taught you, because there's two different Torahs here. It's the way that they're given over, the things that we say about them, the way that we teach Torah that are different. I mean, look at the school systems. In yeshiva, the boys learn Gemara, and they learn all the halachos about all the little about the Beis Hamikdash and about kashrus and about this and that. And while women, of course, are required to learn what's going to apply to them in their life as well, they're much more likely to be learning, the texts that teach the deeper constructs of Torah here. So that's what he's saying. There's two ways of looking at things. Okay, so now insight and analysis. Those are the two different ways of understanding. They're both necessary, obviously, and they both serve different interests. They both have pitfalls, right? In other words, neither is better than the other. Neither is self-sufficient. You really need kind of a both sort of ways of looking at life to get a complete picture. But of course, in the secular world, analysis is more marketable. So it became fashionable to sort of denigrate women's insight, right? Which is a shame. Okay, she comes now to emotional differences. Women, she says, are more emotionally responsive and self-aware because they have a better connection between their intellect and emotions, because information for her is perceived through her insight. So therefore, her emotional responses are going to be different from men. She mentions Chava. Chava was the mother of all creatures, and her name reflects that. Chava is Aim Kol Chai, the mother of all living beings. That's the name she was given. In other words, her role was delineated as mother. So what does mother mean? It means someone who is, and again, this goes back to what we really see our role as, rather as, floor washer and cake baker. We are the mother. We are raising up the next generation, imbuing them with the values that we need them to carry on. And because we're more empathetic, we're more suited for this role. All right. You give, fathers parent differently than mothers do, right? They're not as empathetic. I was sick last week. And, what do I get from my husband? Go to bed, take medicine. That's what I get from, And the kids know also that, Abba is just not going to give them the TLC that Ima gives them. It's just not going to happen. So, and again, because we're the ones that build our children, really build them up, you need to have that deeper insight. You need to have the understanding that of distinguishing child from child and need from need, right? And the insight that comes with that. So that's necessary for that. Okay, and now finally she comes to spiritual differences. Okay, the last difference, spiritual differences. So very interesting discussion here. She says, men and women are different in terms of how they express their spirituality and what's going on there. She says men develop spiritual consciousness through emes, truth, and external acknowledgement, okay? The ability to perceive reality and its external manifestation. This means the search for information. They search for information, they gather outside oneself, studying Torah, observing the world, etc. That's how they do it. They do it in an external way. Women, that's all right. Women, on the other hand, have a more internal process. Their path to God is through emunah. Emunah means belief or trust in God, right? So that is what fuels their spiritual worlds. Faith or complete attachment to God, emunah. Now, this is not about externals. This is about it. It's an internal process. Now, the non-Jewish idea of faith, usually when you hear faith being discussed, is you have the phrase, it's a leap of faith. It requires a leap of faith, right? Judaism doesn't have the same attitude. A leap of faith means what? A leap. I'm going from somewhere where I am to someplace that I'm not. In other words, I have to make a jump over to somewhere that I'm not, right? And we believe that faith is not like that. That's not what we mean by emunah and trust. To us, trust means that we are retaining an image of the way things should be, not the way the believer wants them to be. Okay, so trust is maintaining a relationship with what already is. Okay, and here she gives 3 examples from the Torah of what this difference looks like. Okay, Again, by the way, both trust and insight are good when used appropriately. Other times you need external truths, right? A child needs an external, it needs both. Let's put it that way. So here's 3 examples of this difference of emunah versus, what do we say about men? Emes. Okay. So in the desert, when the Jews were in the desert, Amalek, the tribe of Amalek attacked the Jews, right? They attacked them, and this was understood to be an attack on their faith as well as a physical attack. Now, the Jews fought back. Moshe's role in this was to stand on the mountain and hold his hands up like that. And it says in the Torah that Moshe's hands were emunah, which translates on the surface as steady, okay? But the meaning is also that his response to their attack on the faith was to retain the already existent faith that was part of himself and the Jewish people. So his hands were emunah. Yeah, in other words, the emunah, what was, they fought the attack, Moshe fought the attack with emunah, meaning he knew that there was a solid relationship with Hashem. There was a solid knowledge that Hashem was going to save him. There was a solid truth. He understood there was a faith there that he already had that was strong, and that's what saved them through his hands. Okay, so the second example, okay, we see in the story of the spies, also in the desert. The story of the spies, remember, 10 spies went to Israel to scout out the land before they were going to enter and attack it. They came back, 10 of them, 12 were sent, 10 came back with a negative report. They said, oh my gosh, this land is, and again, this is the men, so they're telling, they were telling what they saw. They saw giants. They said the land is ruled by families of giants. They're just all giants. And again, they were reporting what their eyes saw, right? The men who heard it, who were back in the desert, and who heard this report, also heard those external facts. And based on those external facts, they said, oh my God, let's go back to Mitzrayim. We have to go back to Egypt. We can't win this war. Those are the external facts, right? The women did not have anything to do with this lack of trust. They had a very firm emunah. Their emunah was completely strong, right? They absolutely did not believe the report of the spies. As a result, the punishment was only on the men of this generation, in 2 ways actually. They were not. Remember the whole. I explained to you where we get minyan from, right? The fact that 10 men have to join together in groups of 10 in order to praise God, and this is the reason, right? Because they had such a lack of faith in God. So God said, whenever you get together to praise my name, you now have to do it in groups of 10. Which is why women are exempt from this, because they didn't have anything to do with this lack of belief in God. They had a very firm emunah. They knew that God promised them that I'm going to help you conquer the land. They never lost sight of that. They didn't listen to the externals. So they had that firm emunah. The other thing that they were punished with, by the way, that entire generation, the entire generation of men from a certain age, between certain ages, did not survive going into Israel, but the women did. The women were not punished with that death sentence that the men got.
All the men?
Mm-hmm. All the men between certain ages, like adult, like 20 to, I don't know. But or maybe it was actually after Bar Mitzvah, I'm not sure. But the men were punished that they would not survive the desert. The women didn't have that death sentence on them for this reason, because they had complete trust in God. Okay. The same thing happened with the Chet HaEgel, with the sin of the golden calf. So what happened there? The Satan, we're told in the Gemara, in the Medrash, it says that the Satan, the heavenly prosecutor, he created a vision of Moshe dead, because remember, Moshe was supposed to come down. They were told Moshe was going to come down from the mountain with the luchos after 40 days, after a certain time. And he wasn't coming back. He wasn't coming back, and the day had passed. Again, this was an external fact, right? Moshe is going to come down from the mountain after a certain number of days. He didn't come down from the mountain after that certain number of days because their count was wrong. That was the whole issue, but okay, that's another story. So, and to screw matters up even more, the Satan created this image of Moshe dead and held and showed it to the Jewish people. The men again were trusting their external facts. Here's Moshe, I can see him, he's lying dead on the mountain. And so therefore that led to the Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf. Okay. The women again did not focus on the externals. They were focused on the internal. They had complete trust in God. They knew they didn't waver from their trust. And therefore they also were not punished in the Chet HaEgel. In fact, we were rewarded. Do you remember what our reward for this is? A holiday. Which holiday?
Rosh Chodesh.
Yes. Rosh Chodesh. That's our holiday. That's women's holiday because of this not partaking in this sin. So, so again, they just refused the external facts, if you were, of their eyes, and they listened inwardly to their trust. They just trusted themselves. So, I think we'll just very briefly continue to the chapter 3 because she talks about power being public and private. We've discussed this also, which is why I want to do it rather quickly. The feminists have this issue with it. Power. We want power. We want the same. In other words, we want control. We want control of our lives, and we want control over other people's lives the way men do. Now, but the thing is, there's two kinds of power, right? There's the power that very few people have. We're talking about a powerful person, might be, if you say who's the most powerful person in the world, a president, a king, not today, but a president, right? But there's also a different kind of power that's less visible. And we call that really influence. It's just as powerful, but it's not as visible. It's not as public. But if you ask, so if you ask a person on the street, who's the most powerful person, they'll say the president. But if you say, who's the most influential person in your life, they might say, well, my mother, my father, someone, like that. So there is, power is really the ability to affect change. And so, there's a tremendous acknowledgement from the Torah that women are the power brokers of our society, right? There's a story in the Gemara which is very instructive here. It's a story about I've said this story to you before, but you may have forgotten. It's a story about a couple, a Jewish couple, good people, and they divorce. And each one remarries, and the husband, the good husband, remarries a wife that's really not a good person. And the good wife remarries a man that's not a good person. The end result is that the good man who married the bad wife turned bad. In other words, she influenced him the bad way, to turn bad. The woman, the good woman who married the bad man, influenced him towards the good. So the story is coming to show that women are really the influence power brokers in terms of what matters, which is spiritual matters, of course. And again, of course, another example of the power or influence that women have is that the women were offered the Torah first. Because again, if women don't accept it, it will not be accepted it wouldn't be passed down to the next generation. Okay, that's basically it. And the Torah shows us over and over again examples of women influencing the family, influencing the morals. For example, Sarah and Abraham and Sarah, we're told that Sarah had much more insight into the whole situation with Ishmael and Yitzchak. Yitzchak being Abraham and Sarah's child, and Ishmael being Abraham's child by Hagar, right? Sarah saw something that Abraham just didn't see. She had the insight to see that this child is not a good influence on Yitzchak. And Abraham didn't want to send him away until God had to intervene and say, listen to her voice. listened to her voice. So she saw something he didn't see. Same thing with Rivka. When it came to her twins, she saw something that Yitzchak didn't see. Yitzchak loved Esav, Rivka loved Yaakov, and Rivka saw what Yitzchak didn't see, that Esav was not the one who would be the correct heir of the spiritual throne, as it were, not the right one to pass on the legacy of the Jewish people. It was Yaakov that was supposed to do that. She saw that more than he did. The women in Egypt, it says in the Gemara, it says the women because of the merit of the righteous women of Egypt were the Jews saved from Egypt. Things like that. I mean, this goes on and on and on. So basically, the issue is not whether women should have power, but what kind of power, right, should they continue to have for individual and society's development. Inner success and power is invisible. It's not rewarded by society in general, and it's not recognized. There's no money in it, right? So therefore an outsider looks at the Jewish woman, or the Orthodox Jewish woman, as it were, and says, well, she's at home with the kids, or which is not even true anymore, but she's her, saying it's her job to raise the kids seems like, it's a lesser role. And we're saying absolutely not. We are entrusting her with the most important role in Judaism. And again, if you're the more secular you get, the more you consider the shul rather than home as the more important venue for religious matters, right? But it's not. We really don't consider the shul to be all that important at all. In terms of, it's the place where men get together and daven, and they can do that in a basement too. They don't have to do it in a shul at all. We really don't consider the shul as the center of the Judaism. It's really an influence from Christianity that the temple has become the center of the religion, and which it really is in Christianity. You're a good Christian if you go to church every week. You're a good Christian, but that doesn't really hold the same. In fact, when I was growing up, that's about it for that. When I was growing up, did I stop that? Oh.